The bullet hole in the saloon wall was still smoking when Elara Voss walked through the door and told every man in the room she didn't need a single one of them. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Crestfall, Texas, was the kind of place that swallowed people whole if they weren't careful. Dust settled on everything, on the wooden storefronts, on the horses tied to rails that leaned like old men, on the faces of the people who had come west with dreams and stayed because they had nowhere else to go. The Rio Grande wasn't far, and neither was trouble, and Crestfall had learned to live with both, the way a person lives with a bad tooth, always aware of it, always working around it. Elara had ridden into town that morning on a roan mare she'd borrowed from a homesteader 20 miles east, a mare that was 2 years past her best days but still had enough fire to carry a woman who rode like she was outrunning something, which Elara was. She was always outrunning something. She was 24 years old, and she had the kind of face that made people look twice, not because she was fragile or soft in the way the dime novels described women, but because there was something in her brown eyes that moved like storm water, always shifting, always calculating. Her dark hair was braided and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades, and she wore a canvas work coat over a cotton dress that had been practical once and now just was. She carried a Remington Model 1875 revolver on her hip, not as an ornament, but as a fact of her life, the way some women carried a Bible. She had come to Crestfall because her father's land was in Crestfall, or had been, before the bank specifically, before a man named Harold Cutter had found a way to take it. The saloon was called the Painted Spur, and she'd walked into it because the telegraph office was closed and the sheriff's office looked empty, and she needed information about who in this town could be trusted, which she suspected was nobody, but she wanted to hear it for herself. The men at the bar had turned to look at her the moment she pushed through the swinging doors, and one of them, a wide man with a red face and the particular posture of someone who had spent years believing his own importance, had said something she didn't care to repeat, and that was when the bullet hole appeared in the wall 3 inches to the left of his head, because Elara had drawn and fired before the laughter had fully left his mouth. The room went very, very quiet. "I'm looking for Cutter's land office," she said, her voice level as a carpenter's line. "Somebody point me in the right direction and I'll be out of your afternoon." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then from the back corner of the room, near a table that had a half-played game of cards abandoned on it, a man's voice came, not loud, not sharp, just steady, the way a river sounds when it knows exactly where it's going. "Cutter's office is on the north end of Main. Brown building with green shutters. But I'd wait until morning if I were you." She turned to look at him. He was sitting alone, a coffee cup in front of him rather than whiskey, which she noted. He was tall even sitting down, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed shaving and eyes that were a kind of gray-green that she couldn't quite name. He looked to be somewhere around 30, maybe a year or 2 on either side of it, and he wore a Colt on his hip and a silver deputy's star on his chest that he hadn't bothered to polish. He had the face of a man who had been through something significant and come out the other side of it quieter. "I didn't ask for advice," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He looked back down at his coffee cup, and something about the ease of it, the way he simply accepted her refusal without embarrassment or injury to his pride, made her stay where she was a beat longer than she intended. "Why morning?" she said, against her better instincts. He looked up again, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "Because Cutter's got a man who sits outside that office every afternoon with a rifle across his knees, and that man has a tendency to be jumpy about strangers. Come morning, he'll be sleeping off whatever he drank tonight, and Cutter himself will be sober enough to have a conversation. I'm not interested in conversation. I'm interested in what's mine." The man with the deputy's star said nothing to that. He simply looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being read the way you read a map carefully, without judgment, looking for the landmarks. "I don't need saving," she told the cowboy, the words coming out harder than she'd intended because of how thoroughly she meant them. He set his coffee cup down slowly, and when he looked at her, there was something in his expression that wasn't pity or patronization or the particular male frustration she was used to. What she saw in his face in those quiet eyes was something she hadn't expected at all. "I know," he said. "I can see that clear as day." She hadn't expected that. In 24 years of being Elara Voss, no man had ever simply agreed with her. They challenged it, dismissed it, laughed at it, tried to prove her wrong. Not a single one had just looked at her and said the obvious truth as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She stood there for a full 3 seconds, which was 2.5 seconds longer than she liked to be still, and then she turned and walked out of the painted spur back into the April dust of Crestfall, Texas, and told herself that she was going to forget all about him. She did not forget all about him. She found the boarding house that Mrs. Pettigrew ran on the east side of town, paid for 2 nights in advance with money she couldn't quite afford to spend, and lay on the narrow bed listening to the wind come off the plains and trying to organize her thoughts into something useful. Her father, Thomas Voss, had died 11 months ago, and the land he'd worked for 16 years, 300 acres of good grazing land, with a creek running through the southern portion, had somehow ended up in Harold Cutter's hands before the dirt on Thomas Voss's grave had properly settled. Elara had been in Austin at the time, working as a seamstress and sending money home every month, and by the time she'd gotten word and ridden back, the legal documents were signed and the situation was presented to her as finished. It was not finished. She had spent 11 months gathering what she needed: the original deed her father had filed, the letters from her father describing a visit from Cutter's men 3 weeks before his death, the testimony of a neighbor named Abe Sutter who had seen things he probably shouldn't have seen. She had a lawyer in Austin, a nervous young man named Caldwell who believed in the law more than was perhaps wise, and she had a plan. What she didn't have was anyone in Crestfall who would stand beside her while she walked into that office and made her case, because Cutter was the kind of man who had made himself indispensable to enough people in this town that the law had learned to look in the other direction when he was involved. She thought about the deputy with the quiet eyes and told herself firmly that she didn't need him. She woke at dawn to the sound of the town coming to life: horses, voices, the distant clang of the blacksmith, and dressed quickly, checked her revolver, and went downstairs to the dining room where Mrs. Pettigrew, a formidable woman in her 50s with white hair and an apron that was always immaculate, served her biscuits and salt pork and black coffee without being asked. "You're the one who shot the painted spurs wall last evening," Mrs. Pettigrew said. It was not a question. "It needed shooting," Elara said. Mrs. Pettigrew considered this and then nodded once with the slow gravity of a woman who had seen a great deal of the West and found most of it predictable. "You're not the first woman to ride into Crestfall looking for something Cutter took. You might be the first one who looks like she might actually get it back." "Who were the others?" "Widow family named Sayers, couple years back. Cutter took their farm after the husband died, and before that a ranching family, the DeLacy's, but they left the territory entirely." Mrs. Pettigrew refilled Elara's coffee without being asked. "You be careful of a man named Birch. Boyd Birch. He's Cutter's enforcer, and he's the one sits outside that office with the rifle. I've been warned about him." "The deputy warned you, Callum Reid?" Elara looked up. "I didn't get his name." "Callum Reid. He came to Crestfall 8 months ago from somewhere up near Abilene, I think. Doesn't talk much about where he's been or where he's going. Took the deputy position because Sheriff Hannigan is about as useful as a screen door in a norther." Mrs. Pettigrew said all of this with the matter-of-fact authority of a woman who was the primary information repository of the entire county. He's got good instincts, that man. But he's got some kind of weight on him that he hasn't set down yet. Doesn't matter much to me, Elara said, though she found herself storing the name carefully. Callum Reid. She finished her breakfast, thanked Mrs. Pettigrew with genuine warmth, and walked north on Main Street toward the brown building with the green shutters. It was early enough that the street was still mostly quiet, the morning light slanting gold and long across the dust, and the building she was looking for sat at the far end of the block like a thing that knew it was important. The shutters were indeed green, appealing, ambitious green that had once meant to suggest prosperity, and now mostly suggested that no one had repainted them in several years. There was a sign above the door that read Cutter Land and Title Company in letters that were trying very hard. There was no one sitting outside with a rifle, just as the deputy had predicted. She pushed open the door. The inside of the office was the kind of organized that meant someone spent a great deal of energy creating the impression of order without necessarily having any. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their labels printed in neat block letters. A large desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat a man who could only be Harold Cutter heavyset, somewhere in his late 50s, with the pink, well-fed face of someone who had learned that looking respectable was more than half the battle. He looked up from his papers and blinked at her with the mild surprise of a man who did not often have women walk into his office at 7:30 in the morning. "Miss," he said, "we're not open for business quite yet." "You'll make an exception," Elara said. She placed the folder she'd been carrying under her arm onto his desk, opened it, and set the documents in front of him in a specific order. "Thomas Voss was my father. That is the original deed to 312 acres recorded in this county in 1862. That is correspondence between my father and the county assessor, establishing his continued ownership through 1877. And that is a letter from Attorney James Caldwell of Austin, indicating his intention to file suit in district court, challenging the transfer of said property to your company, which took place in October of last year." Cutter looked at the papers and then looked at her, and she watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the quick, practiced assessment of a man who had spent years determining exactly how much of a problem something was going to be and how best to make it go away. "Your father sold that land willingly," he said. "All the papers are in order. My father was ill and had 2 of your men in his house when he signed those papers. A neighbor witnessed it. A neighbor's word against a legal document. A neighbor's sworn statement, actually, which carries weight in a district court." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not here to threaten you, Mr. Cutter. I'm here to give you the opportunity to do the right thing before this goes to a judge. Return the land, and we call it a misunderstanding. Don't return it, and we make your land acquisition practices very public and very uncomfortable." Cutter leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his substantial middle and smiled at her, and it was the smile of a man who had been in this position before and knew exactly how it ended. "You rode into Crestfall alone, Miss Voss. You're staying at Pettigrew's boarding house. You have one lawyer in Austin who hasn't tried a case of this size in his career." He said all of this quietly, pleasantly, as if he were giving her weather information. "I respect your determination, I genuinely do. But I've handled stronger challenges than yours, and they've all come to nothing." "Then I suppose we'll see," she said, gathered her documents, turned, and walked out. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her back was perfectly straight and her step was perfectly steady, because there was absolutely no circumstance under which she would let Harold Cutter see her rattled. She was 3 steps outside the door when she nearly walked directly into Callum Reid. He caught her by the arm, just a brief, reflexive grip to stop her from stumbling, and then released her immediately, as if he understood that being touched without permission was not something she would appreciate. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't see you coming." I was just leaving, she said, and then because the morning's confrontation was still burning in her chest and he was right there with those steady eyes, she heard herself say, "He's going to try something. Cutter, he's not going to just let this go to court." Callum looked at her for a moment, and then at the building she'd just come out of, and then back at her. "No," he agreed. "He's not. Is there somewhere we can talk that isn't in the middle of the street?" He considered that for a single beat, just long enough to show that he was actually thinking about it rather than just reacting, and then nodded. "There's a bench out front of the dry goods store. Maggie Howell runs it, and she's good about minding her own business." They sat on the bench in the mild April morning, and Elara told him everything, laying it out with the same efficient directness she'd used with Cutter, watching his face as she talked. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated more than she was prepared to. Most men listen to women the way they listen to weather, waiting for it to stop so they could go back to whatever they'd been doing. Callum Reid listened the way you listen when you actually intend to use what you hear. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. A horse went by in the street. Somewhere a door opened and closed. "You've got a solid case," he said. "If Caldwell can get it in front of the right judge." The right judge meaning one that Cutter hasn't gotten to. Exactly. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture that seemed habitual, like something he did when he was working through a problem. "The circuit judge that covers this county is a man named Abernethy. He's honest, which makes him something of a novelty. He comes through in about 6 weeks. 6 weeks. That's going to be the problem. Cutter will move against me before then. Almost certainly." He said it without drama, just acknowledged it as a fact of the situation. He's done it before. The Sayers family, you may have heard about them, left town after their barn burned down twice, and their eldest son got roughed up on the road. Elara felt the cold weight of that settle over her, but she pushed it down. She had not come this far to be intimidated by the arithmetic of what she was up against. "I'm not leaving town. I didn't suggest you should." She looked at him sideways. The morning light was doing something to his profile that she wasn't going to think about. "Then what are you suggesting?" "I'm the deputy here," he said, "which doesn't mean as much in Crestfall as it ought to, because the sheriff is, to be generous, not especially engaged. But it means something. It means have a legal right to involve myself in situations that involve intimidation and coercion. And it means Boyd Birch knows that if he tries something against you on a public road in this county, there will be official consequences." He paused. "I'm not offering to fight your battles, Miss Voss. I'm offering to make sure the fight stays within boundaries where your advantages actually apply." She stared at him. "You're smart," he continued, matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing livestock prices. "You've done your preparation. You've got documents and a lawyer and a plan. All of that is worth something if you can stay alive and intact long enough to use it. What you don't have is local knowledge and a badge. Have both." Elara sat with this for a long moment. 24 years of doing things on her own terms had built in her a resistance to assistance that was almost a physical thing, something she could feel in her chest whenever someone offered to help her, a door closing. She'd built that resistance for good reason. Every time she'd leaned on someone, they'd eventually decided they had better uses for themselves. Her mother had left when she was 7. Her older brother had gone to California and never written. Even the nervous lawyer Caldwell had already sent 2 letters hinting that the case was more complicated than he'd originally assessed. But the man beside her hadn't offered to save her. He'd offered to make sure the environment was one where she could save herself. That was different. That was so different that she almost didn't have a word for it. "We'd be working together," she said carefully. "Not you working for me or me working for you." "That's how I see it," he said, and she heard nothing in his voice that suggested he saw it any other way. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about what we know." They talked for the better part of 2 hours, there on the bench outside Howell's dry goods while the town moved around them and the April sun climbed the sky. Callum knew things about Crestfall that her documents couldn't tell her, who was neutral, who was afraid of Cutter, who had a quiet grudge against him. He knew that the county assessor, a man named Galt, was technically Cutter's man but had a conscience that occasionally inconvenienced him. He knew that the Sayers family had left a full accounting of what had happened to them with a priest in San Antonio, which might be useful. He knew that Boyd Birch, despite his fearsome reputation, had outstanding warrants in 2 counties to the north, which gave Callum leverage if things escalated. And Elara told him things she'd learned in Austin about Cutter's financial dealings, about a lawsuit in another county involving similar land transfers, about the specific legal precedents that Caldwell intended to use. It was, she realized, a genuinely equitable exchange of information, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd had one of those with anyone, let alone a man she'd met in a saloon the previous evening. When they finally stood up to go their separate ways, Callum touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was old-fashioned and somehow not irritating. "I'll check in with you tomorrow if that suits." "That suits," she said, and walked back toward the boarding house and caught herself, about halfway there, wearing something that felt dangerously close to a smile. She removed it before she reached the door. The next several days had a rhythm to them that surprised her, not the frenetic, urgent rhythm she'd expected, but something steadier and more sustainable. Callum was visible enough in town to make Boyd Birch keep his distance, and visible enough in the Painted Spur to keep the general conversation about the Voss woman from turning ugly. He was not, she noticed, visible in the kind of performative way that was really about himself. He simply did what the job required and no more, which she found she respected enormously. She wrote letters to Caldwell in Austin, to the priest in San Antonio who had the Sayers family's testimony, to the district court registrar. She talked to the neighbor Abe Sutter, who turned out to be a weathered old man in his 70s, who had clearly been waiting for someone to ask him the right questions, and who had seen considerably more than she'd known. She visited the county assessor's office and stood in front of Galt with her documents, until he got uncomfortable enough to admit that there were irregularities in the transfer paperwork that he had, at the time, been persuaded to overlook. And every morning, she and Callum met on the bench outside Howell's Dry Goods and talked. It started as a strategic briefing who she'd spoken to, what she'd learned, what he'd observed, but it evolved, gradually and almost imperceptibly, into something broader. She found herself telling him things she hadn't planned to about Austin, about the seamstress work that had worn her hands and paid her way, about the letters from her father that had gotten shorter and more worried in the last year of his life, about the guilt she carried for not coming back sooner. He listened to all of it. He never minimized it, and he never redirected it back to himself. He had a gift for silence that she'd never encountered before, the kind of silence that wasn't absence but was actually presence, the kind that meant you kept talking because the air felt safe. And he told her things too, eventually, with the careful pacing of someone who didn't share easily. He'd grown up in Kansas, the son of a cattle rancher who died of a fever when Callum was 19, leaving him the ranch and the debts and a younger sister named Clara to look after. He'd managed the ranch for 3 years, then sold it when Clara married a good man in Abilene, and had spent the years since doing one lawman's job after another in a string of Texas towns, never quite finding the place that felt like it warranted staying. "What does that look like?" she asked him one morning. "When a place warrants staying." He thought about it for a long time, the way he thought about everything thoroughly and without performance. "I think it's when you can see what you might build there," he said finally. "Not just what you might do, but what you might make that it'd still be standing after you." She thought about the creek that ran through the southern portion of her father's land, the way he'd described it in letters as the most beautiful thing he'd ever owned, the sound of it at night in the summer. She thought about what she meant to do with that land once she got it back, not just grieve her father on it, but actually work it, actually make something of it. "I understand that," she said quietly. He looked at her sideways just for a moment and then back at the street, and she thought she saw something in his profile that she wasn't quite ready to name. On the 8th day, Boyd Birch knocked her down. She was coming out of the telegraph office at dusk. A response from Caldwell folded in her coat pocket, and Birch came out of the alley beside the building and shoved her hard enough that she stumbled and hit her knee on the edge of the wooden sidewalk. He was a big man, rawboned and cold-eyed, with the particular menace of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. "Cutter says you should think very carefully about your next move," he said. "Says roads out of Crestfall are safer than roads into it." She was back on her feet before he'd finished the sentence, revolver out and leveled at the center of his chest, and the expression on his face went through surprise and then calculation, and then settled into a particular kind of dangerous consideration. "You going to shoot me?" He said. "I'm going to report to Deputy Reid that you assaulted me on a public street," she said, her voice absolutely steady despite the pain in her knee and the anger pounding through her blood. "And then I'm going to document this conversation in writing and add it to the file my attorney is presenting to the district court. And then I'm going to go have dinner, because it's nearly 6 o'clock and I haven't eaten since noon." Birch stared at her for a long moment, reassessing something, and then he turned and walked back into the alley without a word. She lowered her revolver and let herself breathe. Callum found her 20 minutes later at the boarding house, sitting at the table in the dining room with her knee elevated on a second chair and Mrs. Pettigrew applying a cold compress to it with grim efficiency. His face when he saw her was carefully controlled, but she'd gotten good enough at reading him to see the flash of something in it, something sharp and protective that came and went so fast she might have imagined it. He sat down across from her and listened to what had happened with the same focused attention he gave everything, and then he said, "I'm going to have a conversation with Birch about his outstanding warrants in Coleman and Callahan counties. Will that do anything? It'll remind him that I know about them, which means he knows I can use them. It narrows his options considerably." He paused. "Are you all right?" "My knee will be fine by morning," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him across the table, and the question sat between them in the warm evening air of Mrs. Pettigrew's dining room, and she understood that he was asking something real, not the social performance of concern, but an actual inquiry into how she was. "I'm angry," she said, "and I'm a little shaken, which I'd prefer not to be, but there it is. And I'm more determined than I was this morning, which I didn't know was possible." He nodded. "All of that sounds right. He's going to try something else," she said. "Cutter, Birch was a warning. If the warning doesn't work, the next thing will be bigger." "Yes." Callum didn't look away from her. "I've been thinking about that. Want to send a telegram to Judge Abernethy's office directly, from the deputy's office, explaining that there are active legal proceedings in this county that require his presence before his scheduled circuit. Think I can make a reasonable case that the circumstances warrant it." Elara straightened in her chair, something coming alive in her chest. "Can you do that? Does that carry enough authority? It's worth trying. Abernethy is a man who takes his responsibility seriously. If he understands that there's active interference with legal proceedings happening, he may come sooner." "How much sooner?" "Could shave 2 weeks off, maybe more." 2 weeks was significant. 2 weeks was the difference between Cutter having time to make additional moves and her having a judge in front of whom to make her case. "Send it," she said. He sent it the next morning, and 3 days later came the reply that Judge Abernethy would arrive in Crestfall in approximately 3 weeks rather than 6, which meant Cutter had considerably less time to work with than he'd counted on. The change in the air was subtle but perceptible, the way you can feel a weather shift before it's fully arrived. Cutter was seen twice in public looking irritated, which Crestfall's small population found both alarming and mildly satisfying, since Cutter normally worked very hard to project only serene confidence. Boyd Birch stayed away from Elara with what seemed like deliberate care. Two of the men who had previously been very vocal about supporting cutters claimed to the Voss land suddenly found themselves with nothing in particular to say on the subject. And Callum and Elara's morning meetings on the bench outside the dry goods store grew longer and then, by unspoken agreement, moved to the dining room of the boarding house over coffee, which Mrs. Pettigrew facilitated with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who was watching something develop that she approved of. There was a morning when the subject of the law and its failures came up, and Elara said something she'd been thinking for a long time, that the law in this territory was applied differently to different people depending on how much power they had, and that the same system that was supposed to help people like her father get justice had been the instrument of taking away what was his. She said it directly, without hedging, because she was tired of hedging, and she watched his face carefully to see if he would defend the institution the way men who wore badges tended to do. He didn't. "You're right," he said. "The law is only as honest as the people enforcing it, and this territory has not always been fortunate in its enforcers. The same legal mechanisms that are supposed to protect land rights have been used to strip them from people who didn't have the money or the connections to fight back. Homesteaders, families who came out here with nothing and built something and then found out that the building of it wasn't enough to protect it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father was one of thousands. The fact that you're fighting back is," he paused, chose his words carefully, "something have a great deal of respect for." She hadn't expected to hear that from a man with a badge, and she sat with it for a moment, feeling it settle into somewhere quiet inside her. "My father believed in this country," she said. "He genuinely believed that if you worked hard and did right by people, it would work out. I used to think that was naive. Now I think it's not naive exactly. It's just incomplete. You also have to fight. Both things can be true," he said. "Believing in something and fighting for it. They're not mutually exclusive." She looked at him, and the morning light was coming through the window of the boarding house dining room and falling across his face. And she had the sudden, overwhelming impression of a man who had spent a long time looking for the thing he was trying to put into words, the place where belief and action could coexist, where goodness didn't require naivety. She thought that he was, quietly and without announcement, one of the finest people she had ever met. She thought this and immediately found 3 things to do with her hands so that her face couldn't give her away. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks before the judge was due to arrive, when things shifted between them in a way that couldn't be unshifted. She had spent the day in the assessor's office going through records with a patience that was beginning to feel like a kind of violence against herself, and she'd found 2 additional irregularities in the land transfer documentation, specific dates that didn't align with what she knew about her father's final weeks, discrepancies that a sharp attorney would be able to use. She was walking back to the boarding house feeling wrung out and quietly triumphant when she heard music coming from the painted spur, not the rough, functional playing she'd heard through the doors on other evenings, but something that actually sounded like a fiddle being played by someone who had a real gift for it. She stopped outside the doors and listened. "They get a traveling musician through every few weeks," said Callum's voice from behind her, and she turned to find him 3 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the saloon with a mild expression. "Woman named Annie Walsh. She's got a circuit that takes her through about 5 towns." "She's extraordinary," Elara said, because the music was extraordinary, a reel that was quick and heartbreaking at the same time, the way the best music tends to be. "She is," he agreed. They stood there for a moment in the April evening, listening through the doors, and the street was quiet except for the music and the wind, and the sky above Crestfall was the particular blue of dusk on the Texas plain, a color that had no precise name and couldn't be reproduced. "Come on," he said, and she registered the slight difference in his voice, something less formal, more direct. "If we're going to stand here, we might as well be inside." "I don't drink," she said. "Neither do I," he reminded her, They went inside. It was the first time she'd been back in the painted spur since the evening she'd shot the wall, and the room looked different with music in it, less hostile, almost warm, the lantern light catching the bottles behind the bar and turning them to amber and gold. Annie Walsh was a compact woman in her 40s with red hair going to silver and a way of playing that made the fiddle seem like an extension of her body. And she was playing to a room that had, against its rough nature, mostly quieted down to listen. Callum found them a table near the back wall, not the same table where he'd been sitting on that first evening, but one where they could see the room without being in the center of it. And a man Elara didn't know brought coffee without being asked, which meant Callum had been a regular long enough that his preferences were known. They listened to 2 songs without speaking, and it was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are comfortable enough not to fill every moment with words. Between the second and third song, Callum said, "I found something today." She looked at him. "About the case. About a man named Webb Sayers." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. "The eldest son of the Sayers family, the one who was roughed up on the road before they left town. He's in San Antonio, same town as the priest who has their testimony." Elara stared at the paper. "And he'd testify about what happened to his family, the coercion, the intimidation. He'd put that in front of a judge. Sent him a letter last week. This is his response." Callum set the paper on the table between them. "He says yes." She unfolded the paper and read it in the lantern light, and the words were exactly what Callum had described: brief, careful, and definitive. Webb Sayers was prepared to testify. He was 22 years old and he was angry, and anger, properly directed, was exactly what she needed. She looked up at Callum across the table, and the fiddle had started again, something slower now, something with a lower register that seemed to fill the room differently, and she said, "How did you find him?" "I wrote a lot of letters," he said simply. She thought about that, about the amount of work it represented, work he'd done quietly and without telling her, not to demonstrate anything to her, but simply because it was useful and he could do it. "Callum," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name without even thinking about it, and she felt him register it the same way she did a slight shift in the quality of the moment. "Yeah," he said, "thank you." He looked at her steadily and didn't deflect it or minimize it or turn it into something performative. He just received it the way a good person receives genuine gratitude. "You don't have to thank me," he said, "but you're welcome." They sat there with Annie Walsh's fiddle filling the air around them, and the evening had its particular weight and warmth. And Elara was aware of the specific distance across the table, not so far that it was formal, not so close that it announced anything, and she thought that she was sitting in this saloon in Crestfall, Texas, with the most unexpected person she had ever encountered, and that something was happening between them that she was not going to be able to pretend wasn't there for much longer. She didn't try to pretend that night. She just let the music play and let the feeling be what it was, which was large and unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable, and also somehow exactly right. Cutter made his next move 4 days later. She came down to breakfast to find a legal document that had been slipped under the door of her room, a countersuit from Cutter's attorney claiming that Thomas Voss's original deed had been falsified, that her father had acquired the land through fraudulent means back in 1862, and that the transfer to Cutter land and title was therefore the legally correct restoration of improperly held property. It was, she recognized immediately, a lie so brazen it almost required respect. The 1862 deed was legitimate, and provably so. There were county records from that year, witnesses still alive who'd been at the filing. But the process of disproving it would take time, and time was what Cutter was buying. She sent a telegram to Caldwell in Austin with the document and then went to find Callum. He was at the sheriff's office, which he largely ran on his own since Sheriff Hannigan operated on a schedule that bore no relationship to actual law enforcement needs. He read the document twice, his expression controlled but his jaw tight in a way she'd come to recognize as the visible surface of controlled anger. "He's stalling," he said. "I know, but it might work. If Caldwell can't disprove the falsification claim before Abernethy arrives, the judge may table everything pending further investigation, which means months more delay." "Caldwell can disprove it," she said. "There are 3 people still living in this county who were present at the original filing. Need to find them and get their signed statements before Abernethy arrives." Callum was already reaching for his hat. "I know where 2 of them live," he said. They spent the next 3 days riding together, on horseback, across the surrounding county visiting the people who had been present at Thomas Voss's original 1862 land filing. The first was an elderly woman named Ruth Hargrove, who lived on a small farm 12 miles east, and who greeted them from her porch with a skepticism that softened into something warmer when Elara explained who she was and what she needed. Ruth Hargrove had known Thomas Voss, had liked him, and had watched what happened to him with quiet fury for 11 months. She signed the statement without hesitation. The second was a retired county surveyor named Amos Chen, a man in his late 60s who had come west from California in the 1850, and who had the particular dignity of someone who had built a life in a territory that had not always been hospitable to him. He was precise and methodical, and his statement, when written, was the most legally exacting document Elara had seen outside an attorney's office. He signed it with the same careful precision he brought to everything. They rode back from his place in the late afternoon of the second day, the plains opening out around them in the golden light, and Elara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 11 months. Not certainty the case was still not certain, but something adjacent to it. The sense that she had done what was possible and done it well, and that the outcome was now in the hands of something larger than either her or Cutter. "Who's the third person?" she asked as they rode. "You said you knew where 2 of them lived. Who's the third?" "A man named Pete Garrison," Callum said. "He was the county clerk in 1862. He moved to a town called Meridian about 5 years ago. I've already written to him." "Ah," she glanced sideways at him. He was riding easily, hat brim against the afternoon sun, and she had been noticing for days, really how naturally they moved together, how the silences between them on horseback were the same quality as the silences at the table in Mrs. Pettigrew's dining room. Easy, settled, like 2 people who had known each other longer than they actually had. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why did you stay in Crestfall? You said you'd been through 5 or 6 towns. Why this one?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "Honestly, I don't know that I had a good reason when I arrived. Hannigan's deputy position came open and I needed work, and the town seemed like it needed someone who would actually do the job." He paused. "But I've been thinking about your question since you asked it the first time, about what a place looks like when it warrants staying. And," he looked at her, and in the fading afternoon light his gray-green eyes were very clear, "I think I'm starting to see it." The heat of that moved through her like a current, quick and certain, and she didn't look away from him. The horses walked on. The plain stretched out. The sky was turning the colors of the end-of-day coral and gold and the first soft hint of purple. She thought, very clearly and without any ambivalence at all, "Am falling in love with this man." And then, because she was Elara Voss and she didn't hide from true things, she let herself feel it instead of arguing with it. They didn't say anything more for a while. They didn't need to. The thing that was between them was there whether they spoke of it or not, and it was large enough that it didn't require announcement. They arrived back in Crestfall as the last light was leaving the sky, and the streets were quiet in the way evening quiets a working town, and Callum walked her to the boarding house door and stood there for a moment in the dusk. "We should look at the documents again tomorrow," she said. "Make sure everything is organized for when Abernethy arrives." "Yes," he said. "Tomorrow." But neither of them moved immediately, and in that pause he reached out and touched her hand, just the briefest contact, the back of his fingers against the back of hers, and she turned her hand over and held his for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not 1 second longer. Then she went inside, and she sat in her room with her heart going faster than it had any business going, and looked at the ceiling, and thought that of all the things she had expected to find in Crestfall, Texas, this was not among them, and that the capacity for surprise was perhaps the most valuable thing a person could possess. The week before Judge Abernethy arrived was the hardest. Cutter, sensing that his window was closing, made 2 additional legal filings, both transparently stalling tactics, both requiring Caldwell to respond, both consuming time and energy that Elara would have preferred to spend elsewhere. Boyd Birch appeared on the street more often, not approaching her but visible in a way that was clearly intended to remind her of his existence. One morning she found that someone had left a dead crow on the front step of the boarding house, which was a message that was both dramatic and, ultimately, ineffective, since it served mainly to confirm that Cutter was rattled. Mrs. Pettigrew swept the crow away with a broom and the expression of a woman disposing of something beneath her dignity. "He did the same thing to the Sayers family," she said. "It means he's scared." "Good," said Elara. Caldwell arrived in Crestfall 3 days before Abernethy, which was both welcome and slightly nerve-wracking, because Caldwell in person turned out to be even younger than his letters had suggested, 26, with round spectacles and hands that didn't quite know what to do with themselves, but with a mind that was, she discovered over the course of a very long evening at Mrs. Pettigrew's dining table, genuinely excellent. He understood the law the way mathematicians understand numbers, not as a set of rules, but as a system with internal logic that could be used carefully and creatively to achieve just results. He and Callum liked each other, she noticed, which she was glad of. Callum asked him precise questions and Caldwell answered them with growing confidence. And by the end of the evening, the 3 of them had a strategy for Abernethy's hearing that felt, for the first time, not just adequate but actually strong. Webb Sayers arrived from San Antonio the following day, and he was everything his letter had suggested, 22 years old, direct, quietly angry in the way that only people who have had something real taken from them understand, and absolutely prepared to put all of it in front of a judge. He had brought, additionally, the priest from San Antonio and 2 letters from other families Cutter had displaced in neighboring counties, families who could not come themselves but whose testimony in writing was now part of the record. The night before the hearing, Elara couldn't sleep. She lay in her room listening to the town and thinking about her father, about the particular way he'd smelled of tobacco and soil, about his hands, about the creek on the southern portion of his land that he'd loved. She thought about all the things she was going to do with that land once she had it back. She thought about what she was going to plant and what she was going to build, and how she was going to make sure that everything her father had built was not just preserved but extended, made more, made better. And she thought about Callum Reid. She thought about him with a fullness and a specificity that would have alarmed her 3 weeks ago, and that now felt like the most natural thing in the world. She thought about his hands on the reins and his voice in the mornings and the way he listened, and the way he'd found Webb Sayers and the way he'd said, "I think I'm starting to see it," with the plain sky behind him. She got up, lit the lamp, and sat at the small desk and wrote him a letter. Not a love letter. Exactly, she wasn't there yet. Or she was, but she wasn't ready to put it all on paper, but something honest. She wrote that she was grateful for him in a way that transcended the practical, that she had not expected to find a person of his particular quality in this particular town, and that whatever happened in the courtroom tomorrow, something had already happened between them that she intended to discuss with him directly once the legal proceedings were behind her. She sealed it and held it in her hands for a long moment, and then put it in her coat pocket, because she was going to deliver it herself and not delegate that to anyone. She slept, finally, a few hours before dawn. Judge Eustace Abernethy arrived in Crestfall on a Tuesday morning in May on the eastbound stage, and he was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined something judicial and remote, a figure of authority in a formal coat. Abernethy was in his early 60s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with a white beard trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that were a very light blue and missed absolutely nothing. He looked like a man who had heard a great many lies and developed an allergy to them. The hearing was held in the largest room available in Crestfall, which was, somewhat inevitably, the back room of the Painted Spur, chairs arranged in rows, Abernethy at the front behind a table that had been cleared of its usual purpose and covered with a cloth. The room was more full than Elara had expected. Word had traveled, as word does in small towns, and the people of Crestfall had come partly out of curiosity and partly out of the particular human need to be present when something important is being decided. Cutter was there with his attorney, a practiced and expensive-looking man named Ferris who had clearly handled these situations before. Cutter himself sat with his hands folded and his expression carefully arranged into something that was supposed to look like dignified patience. Elara sat at the table on the other side with Caldwell and did not look at Cutter. Callum sat in the front row of the audience. He was not part of the legal proceeding. His role had been to create the conditions that made this possible, not to participate in it directly. But he was there, and she could see him in her peripheral vision, steady and present, and it helped. Caldwell opened with the deed. He presented it with the clarity and precision that she'd always hoped he possessed, walking Abernethy through the chain of documentation from the original 1862, filing through Thomas Voss's 16 years of recorded ownership, through the property tax payments, through the correspondence establishing the ongoing relationship between Thomas Voss and the county assessor's office. He was concise and organized, and his voice, which had been slightly reedy in conversation, found authority in front of the judge. Then came Ruth Hargrove's statement, read into the record, then Amos Chen's. Then the letter from Pete Garrison, the former county clerk, who confirmed every detail of the original 1862 filing with the precision of a man who had kept excellent records. Then Webb Sayers took the chair that had been placed for witnesses and told what had happened to his family in a voice that was controlled and clear and devastating in its specificity. He described the men who had come to their home, the conversations that had been conducted while a rifle was visible on the table, the papers his father had eventually signed because the alternative had been made plain. He described the burning of the barn. He described being followed on the road and what had been said to him and what had been done to him. He described his family leaving Crestfall on a wagon with everything they'd managed to load and never coming back. The room was very quiet while he talked. Ferris, on cross-examination, tried to challenge Webb's account on the grounds of distance and time and possible misremembering, and Webb answered every challenge with the specific, grounded detail of someone who remembered perfectly, because you don't forget things that are that important. He was unshakable. Elara felt a tremendous and complicated gratitude toward him, not just for what he was doing now, but for the 11 months he'd spent holding onto it, keeping it, being ready. Then Galt, the county assessor, took the witness chair, and Caldwell asked him the precise, specific questions they had prepared together. And Galt, a man who was not brave, who had never been brave, but who had been carrying a significant discomfort for 11 months, answered them with the slow, painful honesty of someone finally setting down something heavy. Yes, there had been irregularities in the transfer documentation. Yes, he had been approached by a representative of Cutter Land and Title before the transfer was finalized. Yes, Certain concerns he'd had about the documentation had been addressed in a conversation that had not been entirely comfortable. Ferris objected frequently. Abernethy overruled most of the objections with the serene authority of a man who had been doing this for decades and knew a stalling tactic when he saw one. When it was Ferris's turn, he presented Cutter's case the counterclaim that Thomas Voss's original deed had been fraudulent, and Abernethy listened to it with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then asked 3 questions so precisely targeted that Ferris was visibly unsettled by them, because they went directly to the weakest points of the falsification claim and required Ferris to answer with specificity he didn't have. The session ran through the morning and into the afternoon. Mrs. Pettigrew brought food at midday, which Crestfall seemed to accept as the natural and right thing, and people ate and then went back into the room, and the hearing continued. At 4 in the afternoon, Judge Abernethy said he had heard sufficient evidence and would render his decision the following morning. Elara walked out of the Painted Spur into the May afternoon and stood in the street and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding herself together at the highest possible level of function and has now been given 12 hours in which she doesn't have to. Callum was at her shoulder, not touching her, just there. "You should eat something," he said. "Something real." "I should," she agreed, and her voice came out slightly uneven, which surprised her. "Elara." He said her name the way he said everything, with simple, steady attention, no embellishment. "You did everything possible. Everything you could do is done." "I know," she said. "I know that." She turned to look at him, and the late afternoon light was in his face, and she remembered the letter in her coat pocket and thought that 12 hours was actually a very long time to wait. She pulled the letter out and held it out to him. He looked at it and then at her and took it. "Don't read it until tonight," she said. "After dinner." He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it, and then he tucked it into his coat with the care of someone handling something valuable, and they went to find somewhere to eat dinner. And the evening was warm, and the stars came out over Crestfall one by one, and neither of them talked about the letter. But it was present between them the whole time, a warm and significant weight. She slept well that night, which surprised her. She woke clear-headed and dressed with particular care and went downstairs to find that Mrs. Pettigrew had made her best breakfast: eggs, biscuits, actual butter from somewhere, and sat across the table from her with the expression of a woman who intended to take some credit for whatever happened today. "You look well," Mrs. Pettigrew said. "I slept well," Elara said. "Good." Mrs. Pettigrew refilled her coffee. "Whatever happens today, you conducted yourself with extraordinary dignity throughout this entire business, and your father would have been proud." Elara felt the particular ache of that, the sweetness and the grief of it together. "Thank you," she said. Callum appeared at the door of the boarding house at 8 o'clock, hat in hand, and when she came down the stairs into the entryway and looked at him, something in his face told her that he had read her letter and that it had landed exactly as she'd intended. He didn't say anything about it then. He just offered her his arm, a formal, old-fashioned gesture that somehow felt nothing like old-fashioned when he did it, and she took it, and they walked together to the Painted Spur for the second time. Judge Abernethy arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, settled himself behind the table, and looked at the room for a moment with those nothing-missing light blue eyes. "I have reviewed all evidence presented in this matter," he said, in a voice that was dry and precise, "and I find the following. The original deed of Thomas Voss to 312 acres in this county, recorded in 1862, is a legitimate legal document whose validity is confirmed by multiple witnesses and consistent with all county records of that period. The counterclaim of fraudulent acquisition is not supported by any specific evidence and is contradicted by substantial documentation and witness testimony. The transfer of said land to Cutter Land and Title Company in October of last year is hereby declared null and void, on the grounds that the documentation presented at the time of transfer contained material irregularities, and that evidence suggests the circumstances of said transfer involved improper coercion of the original owner. He paused, and the room was so quiet that Elara could hear her own heartbeat. The property known as the Voss homestead is hereby returned to Elara Voss as sole legal heir of Thomas Voss. Additionally, I am referring the actions of Cutter Land and Title Company in this and related matters. He glanced at the written accounts of the Sayers family and the other families to the district attorney's office for further investigation of potential fraud and coercion. He set down his papers. Court is concluded. The room erupted, not in the way of something dramatic and violent, just in the way of people who had been holding their breath, releasing it all at once, a collective exhale that was half noise and half pure relief. People were on their feet. Elara was aware, distantly, of Caldwell saying something jubilant beside her, and of Webb Sayers crossing the room to take her hand with both of his and of Mrs. Pettigrew, who had seated herself in the second row with the right of someone who had earned a front row view, making a sound that was between a laugh and something more emotional. And then Callum was there, and the room fell away somewhat, and she was looking up at him, and he was looking at her, and his face had the open, unguarded quality of a man who has let something down that he'd been carrying for a long time. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. He shook his head once firmly. "You helped, but this was yours." She thought about arguing with him and then didn't, because she was too happy to argue with anyone, even him. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw just briefly, just her palm against his face, and felt him lean into it, fractionally, the way you lean toward warmth when you've been cold. "We need to talk," she said. "Tonight," he said. "We have things to celebrate first." There was celebration, and it was genuine dinner at Mrs. Pettigrew's that involved the entire ground floor of the boarding house being turned into something festive, with Annie Walsh, who had been scheduled to leave town, but had delayed her departure to see how things came out, playing in the corner with a warmth and generosity that filled the room to the rafters. Webb Sayers stayed and ate and laughed, and looked lighter than he had since his arrival, and Caldwell got slightly pink in the face from the toasting that occurred despite the absence of actual liquor from the glasses of everyone involved in the legal proceedings. And Amos Chen was there with his wife, a small woman named Me who had opinions about everything and shared them freely and was wonderful. Elara moved through all of it with a fullness in her chest that she recognized as happiness, simple, complete, uncomplicated happiness. A sensation so unfamiliar that she kept touching it with her mind the way you touch a new tooth to make sure it's real. Later, much later, when the celebration had wound down and the guests had gone and Mrs. Pettigrew had retreated with a meaningful and tactful absence, Elara and Callum sat on the front porch of the boarding house in the May night air, the town quiet around them, the stars enormous overhead the way they only get over open plains where there's nothing to obscure them. She told him what she intended to do with the land. All of it, the practical plans and the dreams she hadn't admitted to anyone, the creek and the things she wanted to grow, and the house she wanted to build that was better than the one her father had lived in. She talked about the kind of life she'd always been working toward without quite being able to name it. And as she talked, she understood that she was also describing what it would need to contain, because a life as large as she was imagining was not a solitary thing. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. "That's a lot of land to work alone," he said, and the way he said it was careful and warm and a little bit tentative in a way she hadn't heard from him before, and she understood that the man who was steady about everything was slightly nervous about this. She turned to face him on the porch steps and said, plainly, without decoration, "I don't want to work it alone. I want to work it with you." He looked at her for a long moment. The night air moved between them, warm and soft. "We've known each other about 3 weeks, he said. "We have," she agreed. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "I was just accounting for it. The tentative quality was gone and something steadier had replaced it. I've been in a lot of places, Elara. Done a lot of things. Haven't felt about a place what I feel when I think about that land with you on it. And I haven't felt about a person. He stopped, and she saw him choose the simplest true thing, the way he always chose the simplest true thing. I haven't felt about a person what I feel about you. She moved closer to him on the step and he put his arm around her, and it fit perfectly. The way things fit that were always supposed to. And she leaned into his side and looked out at the stars over Crestfall, Texas, and thought about the creek on her father's land, and the way the water would sound on summer nights. I love you, she said, because she was Elara Voss and she did not say anything she didn't mean, and she meant this entirely. He was quiet for one breath. I love you, he said, and the simplicity of it was the most beautiful thing she'd heard in her life. They sat there together until the night had grown very late, talking and not talking in equal measure, and when he finally walked back toward the sheriff's office where he kept a room, she watched him go and felt the settled certainty of someone who has found the thing they didn't know they were looking for. She went to the land in the morning. She rode out on the roan mare, the same one that had carried her into Crestfall 3 weeks ago, which Mrs. Pettigrew had been stabling in the meantime, and she went alone this first time, because the first time should be hers alone, just her and her father's land and the morning light. It was everything he had described in his letters. The grass was greening up in the spring warmth, and the creek ran clear and fast through the southern portion, exactly where he'd said it was, with cottonwood trees along the banks that had grown tall enough to make good shade. The house was there, her father's house, smaller than she remembered from childhood, a little weathered, but standing, still standing. She walked through every room slowly, touching the walls, and felt her father's presence in the place the way you feel a person who has been important to you, long after they're gone, not as a ghost, but as something that has been absorbed into the structure of your life and can't be removed. She sat on the porch steps of the house for a long time in the May morning, listening to the creek. Then she rode back to town because she had a great deal to do. The following weeks were a practical whirlwind. There were documents to file and arrangements to make, returning the borrowed roan mare with payment, settling her account with Mrs. Pettigrew, writing to Caldwell with a final accounting of fees. Cutter had left town quietly 2 days after the hearing, and Boyd Birch had been escorted to the county seat to address his outstanding warrants in Coleman and Callahan counties, which Callum had facilitated with efficient satisfaction. Callum also tendered his resignation as deputy, which was not as simple as it might have been, because the town of Crestfall had, over the past several months, discovered that having an actually functioning deputy was considerably more comfortable than not having one. There was a delegation led, somewhat inevitably, by Mrs. Pettigrew that came to the boarding house dining room to discuss the matter, and the resulting conversation produced a compromise. Callum would stay on officially until the end of June to give Sheriff Hannigan time to find a replacement, and that replacement would be someone Callum had vetted. You've done a good thing in this town, Mrs. Pettigrew told him with the gravity of someone issuing a citation. The people here know it, even if they don't always say so. I know, he said. Thank you. Elara hired 3 workers from town, a man named Julio Navarro and his 2 grown sons, who had ranching experience and no current permanent employment, to help begin the restoration and working of the Voss land. They were good workers, all 3, and she had the strong impression that they were also keeping a protective eye on her, though this was never discussed. She moved into her father's house at the end of May, sleeping on a cot she'd borrowed until the mattress she'd ordered from Austin arrived. The first night she lay in the house listening to the creek and felt, for the first time in 11 months, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Callum came out to the land on the weekends, and these days had a quality she hadn't anticipated: a domesticity, a naturalness, the easy companionship of 2 people who were discovering that they fit together in every context, not just in crisis. He knew about fences and water management, and he and Julio Navarro had long technical conversations about irrigation that Elara found she could follow and contribute to, because she'd been paying attention to land management her whole life. She and Callum cooked dinner over the fireplace in her father's kitchen and sat on the porch afterward and talked about what they were going to plant in the fall and where the new section of fence needed to go. It was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. One evening in early June, sitting on the porch with the last light dying over the plain, Callum said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a ring, simple, silver, with no stone but a delicate engraved pattern around the band that caught the dying light. "This was my mother's," he said. "She would have liked you. Not because you're easy or because you'd have been comfortable for her. She was pretty comfortable with difficult people, but because you're real. She valued real people above everything." He held it out. "I know what I want. I know where I want to be. But this is your question to answer, and whatever your answer is, I need you to know that it doesn't change what I said to you on that porch last month." She looked at the ring and then at his face, that face she'd cataloged so thoroughly over the past weeks, the jaw and the gray-green eyes and the particular line of his brow when he was being serious, which was most of the time. She took the ring and held it for a moment, the way she'd held the letter she'd written him weeks ago, feeling its weight. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He smiled, then really smiled, the kind that wasn't in the neighborhood of a smile but was the full actual thing, and it changed his whole face, opened it up, made him look younger and more purely happy than she'd ever seen him, and she was glad to be the person who had put that smile there, and she intended to be the person who put it there for the rest of their lives. She put the ring on and held out her hand to look at it in the last of the light, and he took her hand and held it, and the creak in the distance made its steady music. They were married on a Saturday in late June, in the small church that Crestfall maintained in the northern part of town, by a minister named Father Bennett, who had the tolerant, experienced warmth of a man who had officiated at ceremonies in many different kinds of circumstances, and found each one equally meaningful. It was not a large ceremony. Elara had no family left to invite, and Callum had only his sister Clara and her husband, who had ridden south from Abilene for the occasion, arriving 2 days before the wedding on a stage that was 40 minutes late, and emerging from it covered in dust and entirely cheerful. Clara Reid was 28 and looked like her brother around the eyes and was absolutely nothing like him in temperament, being quick-talking, warm, and disposed to find most situations excellent. "She told me in a letter about you," Clara said to Elara, the evening before the wedding, over dinner at Mrs. Pettigrew's, while Callum and Clara's husband Robert were having a conversation about cattle prices. "She being me, I mean. I wrote to him months ago asking if there was anyone interesting in Crestfall." "And what did he say?" Elara said. Clara's smile was very like her brother's except more frequent. "He said the situation was complicated." Which meant yes, very much yes, and he didn't know what to do about it. He never does with things he actually cares about. He gets careful. She tilted her head. "But he asked me to bring Mother's ring. So I knew." Elara looked at the ring on her finger and felt something warm and layered move through her. She started, and then stopped, because the thing she wanted to say was too large for the middle of dinner. "I know," Clara said, with a gentleness that was nothing like her usual quick warmth. "He is." The ceremony was in the morning, with May sunlight coming through the church windows at the angle that made everything look deliberate, and the small assembly of people Mrs. Pettigrew, the Navarro family, Amos and Mi Chen, Caldwell, who had returned from Austin for the occasion, Annie Walsh, who was passing through again on her circuit, and a handful of townspeople who had been part of the story in one way or another watched, with the satisfied attention of people who had seen the build-up and were happy to be there for the conclusion. Elara wore her best dress, which was not particularly elaborate but was a warm blue-green color that her father had once said matched the creek in summer. And she carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Clara had assembled from the area around the boarding house with determined efficiency. Callum wore a suit that fit him better than anything he'd worn since she'd met him, and when he turned to watch her walk down the short aisle, the look on his face was everything she'd ever wanted to be the cause of. Father Bennett married them with words that were both standard and, somehow, exactly right. When he said, "You may kiss your wife," Callum cupped her face in both hands the way you hold something you intend to keep, and kissed her with a tenderness that made Clara sniff and Mrs. Pettigrew make a sound of profound approval. They held a small celebration afterward at Mrs. Pettigrew's, and it was very like the celebration after the hearing, except with added joy in Clara, who had opinions about the arrangement of all the food and voiced them freely, and was completely correct about everything. They spent that night and the following 2 days in the house on the Voss land, which was now their house and their land and their beginning. The creek sounded exactly as Elara had imagined it in the night she'd spent planning this, and Callum stood on the porch at dawn on their first morning there, and looked out at the land with the specific expression of a man who has found the place where the things he wants to build are going to stand. "This is it," he said. "This is the one." "Yes," she said. She was standing beside him with her coffee, and the morning was cool and clear, and the land stretched out ahead of them green and possible. "This is the one." The years that followed were good ones. Not without difficulty, the first winter tested them with weather that was harsher than either had hoped, and there were cattle losses and fence failures, and a creek flooding in the spring of 1880 that took out a section of the lower pasture they'd only recently finished improving. There were the adjustments of 2 strong-willed people learning to share a life and a decision-making process, conversations that were sometimes heated and always honest, because neither of them had any particular gift for dishonesty, and both of them would rather have a real argument than a false peace. But the land prospered. They expanded carefully, adding acreage over 2 years as adjacent parcels became available, because there were still families leaving the territory in those years, still people who had given the frontier everything they had and found it hadn't been enough. Where they could, Elara and Callum hired those people, first gave them work and fair wages, and the dignity of being useful, which sometimes made more difference than the money. Julio Navarro and his son stayed on, becoming in the way of ranch work a kind of extended family present at holidays, present at emergencies, woven into the fabric of the place in the way that the best working relationships become indistinguishable from friendship. Clara and Robert came to visit every spring, and the visits grew longer each year in proportion to what there was to see and celebrate. In the fall of 1879, Elara told Callum that they were going to have a child, and watched the thing that happened to his face, the specific, complicated happiness of a person who has wanted something for longer than they knew, and thought that she would carry that expression in her memory for the rest of her life. Their son was born in March of 1880, on a night when the wind was up and the creek was high, and Mrs. Pettigrew, who had driven out from town with the efficiency of someone who had anticipated this need, supervised everything with absolute calm. He was a healthy, substantial baby with Callum's gray-green eyes and Elara's dark hair, and an expression of intense interest in everything around him from the first hours that made both of his parents laugh. They named him Thomas for her father, and his middle name was James, for the nervous young lawyer in Austin who had believed in the law enough to take an unprovable case, and had been, in the end, entirely right to do so. Caldwell had responded to the letter telling him about the baby's name with a response that was slightly pink in tone and very moving, and that Elara kept in the desk in the study that was now her office. Thomas Voss Reid turned out to be, as the first years of his life unfolded, A child of particular character, curious and stubborn and intensely physical. A child who learned to walk early and immediately used the skill to go places he shouldn't. He loved the creek with a devotion that his grandfather would have recognized, and spent enormous amounts of his toddlerhood crouched at its edge, watching the water and the creatures in it with a scientific seriousness that made Callum say, more than once, that the boy was going to be something specific and interesting when he grew up, though it was too early to know what. A daughter followed 3 years later, in 1883. They named her Ruth, for the old woman who had signed her statement without hesitation and whose quiet courage had been one of the first things to turn the tide. Ruth Reid was smaller than her brother at birth, but made up for it in volume and opinion. And by the time she was 2, she had already established that she was not going to do anything the easy way if the interesting way was available. Clara, on a visit shortly after Ruth's second birthday, held the child in her lap and watched her attempt to dismantle a teaspoon with pure force of will, and said, with great satisfaction, "She's exactly like you." "Is that a compliment?" Elara said. "The highest possible," said Clara. The Voss land, they kept that name for the ranch, because it was the right name and Callum had said so from the beginning. Firmly and without sentimentality, became one of the better-known ranches in the county. Not the largest, but consistently well-run, consistently honest in its dealings, and with a reputation for treating its workers with fairness that drew good people to it and kept them. Elara took on, gradually and somewhat inevitably, a role in the wider community that she hadn't planned, but that felt natural once it arrived. She was someone people came to with problems, with disputes, with the specific kind of trouble that required clear thinking and the willingness to stand up and say what was true. She was not soft about it, and she was not always popular because of it, but she was trusted, which was the thing that actually mattered. The district attorney's investigation of Cutter's land practices, which had been set in motion by Judge Abernethy's referral, ground on slowly in the way of legal processes, but it ground on. By 1881, Cutter had been formally charged with multiple counts of land fraud and coercion, and by 1882, he had pleaded guilty to a reduced set of charges in exchange for a substantial financial settlement that compensated the families he had displaced, including the Sayers family, whose money arrived in San Antonio on a Wednesday in October, and about which Webb Sayers wrote Elara a letter that made her cry productively over her breakfast. Callum's former role as deputy had been replaced, eventually, by something that suited him considerably better. He was appointed as a county surveyor and land registrar, a position that made use of his precision and his institutional knowledge and his fundamental belief that people had a right to own what they'd worked for, and that the documentation of that ownership was a genuine and important service. He was good at it in the quiet, thorough way he was good at most things, and he came home from the office most evenings looking like someone who had done something useful with the hours. On a summer evening in 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Ruth was nearly 2, Elara and Callum sat on the porch of the house, which had been extended twice since they'd first lived in it, and now had a proper roof over the porch, and a swing that Thomas had already broken twice, and that Callum had repaired each time without particular complaint, and watched the light go off the land in the long, golden way of summer evenings in Texas. Thomas was in the front yard, attempting to teach the ranch dog, a behavior that the dog was tolerating with philosophical resignation. Ruth was asleep inside, her early evening sleep that would last until about 9 and then result in a period of opinions after which she'd sleep until morning. "I've been thinking," Elara said. "About what?" Callum said. "About what my father used to say, that if you work hard and do right by people, things work out." She looked out at the land, spent a long time thinking that was incomplete. "That you also have to fight, and I still think that's true." She paused. "But I've been thinking that I left something out too," He waited. "You also have to find the right people," she said. "The right person." She glanced at him sideways. "It matters who you're doing it with. The fighting and the working. It matters who's beside you." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that she had spent 7 years learning and would spend the rest of her life discovering, and he said, "Yes, it does." She put her head on his shoulder, and they sat there while Thomas had a complex negotiation with the dog, and the evening gathered itself around the ranch, and the creek made its sound in the distance, that sound she had imagined for so many nights before she'd heard it in person. She thought about the morning she had walked into the painted spur and told every man in the room she didn't need a single one of them, and how entirely true that had been. She had not needed any of them. She had not needed to be rescued or managed or handled. She had needed a specific and unusual thing, the thing Callum had given her without knowing he was giving it, on that first evening when he'd agreed with her instead of arguing. He had not offered her saving. He had offered her honesty and partnership and the kind of respect that doesn't require you to be anything other than exactly what you are. And she had built a life out of that. A real life, with weight and difficulty and joy and the particular satisfaction of work that meant something, in a place that was hers, with people she loved. She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers in the easy, permanent way of someone who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. Thomas achieved something with the dog, unclear what, and raised both arms in triumph, and the dog sat down and looked at him with long-suffering affection, and Callum laughed, a quiet, deep laugh that she felt through his shoulder more than she heard it, and the stars were beginning to come out. Over the Voss land, one by one, the way they had on every night of every year that had passed since the spring of 1878, when a woman had ridden into a dusty Texas town on a borrowed roan mare and walked into a saloon and said, with complete conviction, that she didn't need saving. She had been right, and the cowboy who had agreed with her had changed her whole life.